In the previous two videos, we considered the other and the body. The other is first encountered as a gaze that I experience as shame in finding myself the object of another. The body is first experienced as an inseparable feature of consciousness, which I discover in the ways I use tools in the world. From this most fundamental dimension of the body, I then encounter the body of others as objects, but in a manner unlike other objects, since the other's body is part of an entire situation that includes my encounter with their consciousness as a dimension of my own consciousness. Through this encounter with the other, I arrive at a third body, my body, that becomes an object for the other. A dialectical tension emerges in this relation with the other. I only encounter the other in their transcendence, which turns me into an object. I express my own transcendence by overcoming the other's transcendence in objectifying them. Thus, Sartre writes, conflict is the original meaning of being for others. This general description of our relationship with the other takes on particular dimensions and attitudes, which this video will address. Three attitudes in particular are discussed here: love, desire, and hate. Finally, Sartre ends this chapter addressing those experiences that move beyond the self-other dyad to include other others, leading to the collective experience of being a we subject and an us object. All these attitudes play out various dimensions of our being for others that concern this conflict of our, on the one hand, freedom and transcendence, expressed when we gaze upon the other, and on the other hand, with our objectification and alienation experienced when we find ourselves gazed upon by the other. The first attitude Sartre addresses is wanting to be loved. To feel I am loved by another requires the other make a free choice. She cannot be compelled or forced to love me, as I would feel she only acts like she loves me rather than actually loves me. If she loves me out of guilt, or because I remind her of her father, or because I have money, or because her parents pressured her, then I would have a hard time feeling like this is genuine love. Instead, the experience feels contrived. At the same time, I want there to be an element of necessity in our love. I don't like to think of our relationship as purely accidental or by chance. If I feel myself as merely one of a set of equally viable options, if our love was only due to a set of random factors, I would feel like this love lacks the specialness that love should have. And we have words for this like soulmate, being made for each other, and destiny to describe the reasons why we love each other. Additionally, not only do I want to be loved once, but I want her to always love me, to faithfully commit herself to me and only me. But I would only want her to commit to love me forever, not out of obligation, but because she freely chooses to do so. So we can perhaps begin to see some of the contradictions of love being expressed here. How can anyone both promise to love another for the rest of one's life and do so in a way that is completely free? It's like saying, I freely commit myself to love you now, and I compel my future self to forever freely commit to you down the road. 10 years later, am I committed to you because I am freely choosing it now, or because my past self freely made that promise that I must now adhere to out of a sense of obligation? Sartre identifies these contradictions of love. The lover wants the beloved's freedom to freely choose to love, and yet also wishes this freedom to be self-captivated and consistently reaffirmed, creating a dynamic tension between freedom and necessity. Now, one of the primary ways love expresses itself is through words. As we saw in the previous chapter, language marks an integral aspect of being for others, and it is through language given by the other that I objectify myself as a body or its pains as illness. Sartre elaborates here that language forms part of the human condition, serving as a proof of one's being for others. And language has a very particular use in love, as revealed through seduction. Seduction does not aim principally at describing a state of affairs. It serves not to inform another about an experience, but to cause the other to undergo an experience. It's what the philosopher J.L. Austin calls a performative utterance. In trying to seduce someone, the seducer seeks to exert an influence that excites hope or desire. This language inherently recognizes the consciousness of the other, but seduction also seeks to capture this freedom by capturing it as an object, directed toward the aims of the seducer. In seeking love, each person seeks to be the object of the other's affection while maintaining their own subjectivity. But as we've seen, this desire is inherently contradictory. This leads to a cycle where each lover wants to be loved and to have their being validated by the other, yet any accomplishment of this love undermines the very subjectivity they wish to preserve. As such, love, as a mode of being for others, contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. This leads to a perpetual dissatisfaction, insecurity, and shame, as the lover's being is constantly threatened by the other's potential to objectify them. The masochist seeks to surrender to this objectification by the other by pursuing the annihilation of their own subjectivity. However, masochism is inherently doomed to fail because I cannot truly apprehend myself as the other does, that is, as an object. And this is because my attempts to be turned into one are constantly being overwhelmed by my own subjectivity. The masochist's attempt to be objectified by the other only, in fact, reinforces their own transcendence, highlighting the self-defeating nature of masochism. Sartre goes so far as to say, even the masochist who pays a woman to whip him is treating her as an instrument, and by this very fact posits himself in transcendence in relation to her. As such, masochists live in bad faith in proclaiming to accomplish the impossible feat of annihilating their subjectivity. My original attempt to get hold of the other's free subjectivity through his objectivity for me is sexual desire. Notably, Sartre distinguishes the attitude of love from the attitude of desire. What's the difference here? In love, I'm seeking a free and absolute recognition of my being to redeem me and my objectification from the original fall that is my shame in the encounter with the other. And I find myself the unique absolute center from which all things have their meaning and value for the other. In desire, sexual desire more specifically, I am seeking to get hold of the other's subjectivity in and through their objectivity. Sexual desire is not reducible to pleasure or some physical act. It is a non-reflective longing for a transcendent object, fundamentally tied to our being for others. And this is why being a sexual being is not limited to individuals who are even physically capable of engaging in the act of sex. It is a pervasive element of who we are throughout our lives. And one of the interesting things about this desire is that whereas we may ordinarily pass over the body through the annihilating upsurge of the forward self, in desire, we exist our bodies much more intimately with our consciousness. But it's for this reason that Sartre describes desire as trouble. As such, desire is not merely about obtaining an object within a kind of static world, but it involves a radical modification of consciousness and its relationship to our world, leading to a new world of desire. In this world, the body is lived as flesh, and objects are perceived in a way that reveals my own incarnation. So what is meant here by flesh and incarnation? We mentioned a little bit about flesh in the previous video, and it should be distinguished from mere objectification of the body. Instead, it is the way consciousness feels its body when being affected or touched by another. Incarnation identifies this process of consciousness becoming flesh. If normally we pass over the body in the upsurge of consciousness, incarnating as flesh is where consciousness experiences and lives itself as body. Sartre uses the term caress to talk about how I may provoke the flesh in the other and the other provoke it in me. He writes, "The caress is not a simple stroking. It is a shaping. In caressing the other, I cause her flesh to be born beneath my caress, under my fingers. The caress is the ensemble of those rituals which incarnate the other. And he adds, the caress has for its goal only to impregnate the other's body with consciousness and freedom. In caressing the other, my own flesh can be incarnated through the reciprocal caress from the other. Desire desires to experience this mutual incarnation where each consciousness realizes the other's incarnation through the contact of their flesh, where each becomes fully present to the other as flesh. Now, if desire concerns a reciprocal incarnation wherein each caresses the other to give rise to their flesh that in turn gives rise to mine, then in sadism, the sadist continues to seek the other's incarnation, but not their own. And how the sadist wishes to incarnate the other's flesh is not by caress, but by force and by aiming at the obscene. So what does Sartre mean here by obscene? He says it belongs to the category of the ungraceful. And he defines grace as the body's transcendence and harmonious integration with actions and situations. So there's a unity of body and mind, so to speak. In contrast, the obscene emerges when the body's movements become disconnected from its actions, revealing the inert facticity of flesh in a manner that is unjustifiable and abrupt. This revelation of flesh devoid of grace constitutes the essence of the obscene. The ultimate goal of the sadist is to appropriate the other's freedom, which is inherent in their flesh, through acts of violence and humiliation, leading to a moment where the other's body is wholly flesh and the other's freedom is perceived as broken and enslaved, culminating in the sadist's pleasure at witnessing the other's freedom succumb to the flesh. But as is the case with masochism, sadism is a pursuit that ultimately fails because it cannot reconcile this instrumental use of the body with the body as flesh. To have freedom succumb to the flesh is impossible because flesh is intrinsically an integration of consciousness with the body. So if freedom succumbs, we no longer have flesh, but merely an object, a body. And it's also impossible for the sadist to fully appropriate the other's transcendent freedom. It always remains elusive. And as such, the sadist remains in bad faith here. So we've explored how there's failure inherent in many of the attitudes that we've addressed. Love, desire, and their corresponding variations of masochism and sadism. The failure has to do with the inability to preserve subjectivity while also trying to possess it in some way, to appropriate the other's freedom. And this impossibility can ultimately give rise to a third attitude, which Sartre identifies here as hate. Hate represents a resignation to the impossibility of using the other as a means to affirm one's own being, leading to a desire to eliminate the other instead. So as a result, hate does acknowledge the other's freedom, but instead of trying to appropriate it in a way that can rescue one's own subjectivity, in hate, one seeks to destroy the other, both in their subjectivity and also their objectivity. It is an act of asserting one's own freedom in the face of the others, often arising paradoxically from acts that might otherwise inspire gratitude. And why does Sartre mention gratitude here? Well, because to be grateful for a kindness done by the other is to recognize that the other was under no compulsion to act in the way they did. As such, is an act of asserting one's freedom in the face of the others. And while gratitude may be a response to this act, the act can also elicit resentment to the other for having once again confronted me with my own alienation before their freedom. And Sartre clarifies here that hate is not merely about destroying a particular other, but it's an attempt to symbolically eliminate the presence of otherness altogether by targeting one particular other, so as to reclaim one's freedom from the perceived enslavement and alienation one undergoes in encountering the gaze. However, Hate, like all the other attitudes thus far discussed, ultimately fails because it cannot erase the past existence of the other, nor can it get rid of the hater's own history, which includes one's having been being for others. And this leaves the hater perpetually contaminated by this dimension of otherness as integral to their own being. There is simply no escape from the gaze, and the death of the other only solidifies the hater's objectification. And I think this is where Freud and Sartre can agree. Freud talked about how the death of the father leads to the return of the father in a more oppressive form. There's no getting rid of the gaze. And this shows that hate cannot break the cycle of alienation, and that, in fact, it ultimately only leads to despair. Up to this point, we focused on relationships as they pertain to a singular self and other, whether the singular other or the notion of the other in general. However, I don't always merely identify as an individual, but also as part of a collective. And in this last section of the chapter, Sartre seeks to explore this dimension of the we. The concept of we signifies a community of subjects recognizing each other as subjectivities rather than as objects. This collective consciousness arises in shared experiences like spectators at a performance or a religious community during liturgy. The we experience transcends any individual rivalries, uniting subjects in common actions and perceptions. And Sartre clarifies that this we experience is not some fundamental aspect of the self, nor does it form the basis of our consciousness of the other. Rather, it's a specific experience that is dependent on a prior recognition of other consciousnesses as either transcending or being transcended. As such, the we emerges from the general foundation of our being for others. Sartre also distinguishes this we experience of subjects from the us that is experienced when we find ourselves collectively being objects for another. Thus, there are two radically different forms of the experience of the we, corresponding to the act of looking and the experience of being looked at, which constitute the fundamental relations of the for itself with the other. A critical dimension of the us object experience is the arrival of what Sartre calls here the third. The third, as in the third party, distinct from the self other dyad, gazes upon this dyad, leading to a shared sense of alienation that gives rise to a collective. The presence of the third leads to a mutual recognition of responsibility, forming a collective us that is engaged in some common struggle, transcending individual conflicts and uniting the participants in a shared objective reality. Now, any human situation can evoke the feeling of us when observed by the third. But a notable case that Sartre focuses on here is class consciousness, which arises when individuals within an oppressed group recognize their collective alienation through the perspective of a third, that is, here an external observer representing the oppressing class. This recognition is not based on the hardships of work or living standards alone, but on the realization that their existence and struggles are defined and observed by those in power. The oppressed experience themselves as a unified us when viewed by the third, whose privileges highlight the oppressed group's collective alienation and subjugation within the social structure. While the oppressed class may unify as an us object against an oppressing they, the oppressors do not necessarily or naturally form a we subject. And this is due to the inherent disunity within this group and their denial of class consciousness altogether. The oppressors only experience themselves as a collective us when they're directly confronted by the oppressed. And even then, it is an experience often marked by fear and shame. This confrontation of the oppressor by the oppressed also allows the transformation of the oppressed, now from this us object into a we subject. And this concludes the section entitled Being for Others. The next and final section of Being in Nothingness focuses on the notion of the act as another essential characteristic of the for itself in its relation to and modification of the in itself. But what does it mean to act? Why does the for itself act? And how can it act? These questions will be examined in the final section of the text entitled Having, Doing, and Being. If you found this video helpful and want to support this work, some ways you can do that include subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, liking this video, sharing this video on different platforms to get other people aware of the channel. And if you want to make a financial contribution, you can do so through the Super Thanks button below here on YouTube. And to be a more regular supporter, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I'd like to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. So we're almost there. Just 2 more chapters. I anticipate 3 more videos for Being in Nothingness. The 2 videos corresponding to the 2 last chapters, and then a concluding video on all of Being in Nothingness. Following that, we're going to move right into Maurice Merleau-Ponty's The Phenomenology of Perception. And I'm looking forward to getting started with that soon. So until the next time, thank you for watching. Be well.